delighted to be here. I cannot tell you what happens that is such a burst of energy and excitement when I come to Istanbul. It is certainly one of the great cities of the world, and Turkey as well, one of the great countries. I am honored to be here. I'm just pleased to come, and I'm honored to be here at a time when you're also having these threats. I'm from New York, and 9/11 was a major event for us. And I only want to say that it had a profound impact on us, but the impact, there were two sides of it. The best part of it was all of our cultures in New York kind of came together as one after that event. But the negative side is that there was too much fear. And the fear was manifested in how we designed the buildings and the streets. We lost the kind of soul and that we needed to live in after such an event. So my strong urging for you is to become more a part of your community, to come together around the aspects that make you happy and alive, and blend those with the larger community that you're part of to make your country whole, so that those kinds of terrible events don't have any stature among anyone, that they're not something that should be happening in any country anywhere in the world. But it's not just about saying you don't do it, it's about creating an environment where it can't happen. And that's what I'm going to talk about, is how do we define the city of the future? How do we create the kind of environments in our cities, in our communities, in our neighborhoods, in our small towns that bring people together and give them a sense of their future and a sense of their future life as part of that community. And as part of that, we have been working with UN Habitat. There's a Habitat 3 conference coming up in, let me get this timing on here, there we go. There's a Habitat 3 coming up in October in Quito, Ecuador, and then we had the COP21 meeting in December, and putting environment and the cities together, creating a future that is more sustainable, more equitable, more inclusive, more about each culture and supporting the culture is really the future. And what Dr. Close is talking about as part of the UN Habitat, we have to redefine what is the new paradigm for the postmodern city. And that's what I'm going to talk about. I know that there are tremendous difficulties in cities all over the world. We would actually say that starting in about 1977, that the cities began to be taken over by narrowly focused disciplines like traffic engineers, some of the design disciplines, and we've got to find a way to merge that. Now, interior design, to me, is one of the more holistic, more inclusive design practices, sort of like industrial design. But some of the other design disciplines like landscape design and architecture have done things that are more about their ego and not about the communities they're in. So we get this kind of false sense that the future is about architecture when it's really about architecture that creates place. And if we can do that, and we can get back to realizing that it's about the social life of small urban spaces, it's about the city at eye level, and it's about the feeling that people have in a community, and if we can understand that and allow that to come forward, and I believe that the interior design profession has some of the best skills to be able to do that. So I'm going to be talking about that. So when we talk about the future paradigm shift, we think that place and placemaking could be that idea. The fact that it can mobilize entire communities, cities, and countries to define their future around place and placemaking. That it can add purpose and foundation to people's lives. That it creates ownership and shared value. It allows local wisdom and common sense to thrive. It's community-based, holistic, and inclusive, and the outcomes can be enormous, and they can be done quickly. And that's what I'm going to go through this presentation, so hold on to your seats. One of our partnerships is with a foundation in Sweden and the UN Habitat, and we have had 3 years of conferences and meetings about the idea that place and placemaking can be part of the future paradigm for cities, and our partnership was with the UN Habitat. And so the whole new urban agenda is moving in our direction, and we have been working very carefully with countries around the world to begin to put the idea that community and place are a critical part of our future agenda. One of our activities that we were engaged in was doing an international market conference and creating cities that are defined by markets, neighborhood markets, community markets. Barcelona is the gold standard of that, with 43 markets in the city. No one is more than a 10-minute walk from a market. How do we recreate that? Instead of having just shopping centers, how do we have small markets that are part of community gathering places? We had something like 47 countries come to this meeting in Barcelona, and these are the destinations within Barcelona where they have markets. And they've also actually become, if you're aware of the tremendous shift towards innovation districts, well, the Innovation Center in Barcelona actually dispersed itself to be innovation around markets, so that the job creation broadened around markets to become innovative centers as well, or innovative center hubs. And those markets are some of the most extraordinary design buildings ever, and Barcelona is putting money into restoring those and making them extraordinary destinations. So I'm going to talk about how placemaking can make this happen. And we've been working all over the world, something like 47 countries, 1,000 cities, 3,000 communities, many communities in these cities, doing what we call placemaking over the last 40 years. We started Twitter about 7 or 8 years ago, and we were really the foundation of that idea. But now it has spread, and we've become a platform. We're no longer the center of that concept, and there are now 200 people around the world tweeting about placemaking. So when one of our tweets goes out, it goes viral. And so there's this massive movement. This is, that we have about 200,000 people that follow us on the various medium. So when we do something and when we crowdsource what other people are doing and send it out, it hits every single country. And the creative energies, people who are transforming their cities, we believe that the people who are doing placemaking around the world are the ones that are going to change our cities fundamentally. They're going to change the politics, they're going to change the way professions function, they're going to change the way communities behave, and how they can help define their future. Now, one of the great opportunities is the whole concept of convergence. So the idea of place does not replace anything, it adds to the So it adds to architecture and design, and I'll talk about smart growth, about climate change, about local food systems, transportation, historic preservation, public health, local economies, community engagement, urban equity. It enhances each of those movements, doesn't replace them, it reinforces them. And for me, I started doing this work. I organized Earth Day in 1970 in New York City. And then I started working with these amazing people, Christopher Alexander, The Pattern Language, William White, who wrote The Social Life of Small Urban Spaces, who I worked with. I studied with Margaret Mead, Jane Jacobs, and other people who were the foundation of amazing thinking back in the 70s. That was lost in the 80s and 90s, and now it's coming back as a real foundation for what the future thinking about cities are. And one of the things I did when I was first working with Holly White, William White, is I did a movie on the day in the life of a wastebasket on Lexington Avenue in Manhattan. And it was and it's this, on the left there, the wastebasket was placed next to a lamppost. And because there was a little bit of space between the wastebasket and the lamppost, people would come in there and stand and just watch the world go by. But the wastebasket was also designed with a flat surface and a hole in it. And one day I was watching this, taking a movie of it, and this man came along and he put the newspaper that he had into the throat of the wastebasket. And then about 2 minutes later, a very well-dressed man came along, picked it up, looked at it, and then put it back in. He didn't want to read that one. And then a few minutes later, someone else came along and took it away. So the whole life of a wastebasket, where it's located, how it's designed, and many other of the elements are a critical factor in how people use the public spaces they're in. But Holly White, oh, and the other one was that storefront there. You can see the way the window is canted. And I went into that store owner and he said I said there are 40,000 people walking by your storefront every day. You must like that. And he said, no. And I said, why? And he says, because I'm next to bank and people start walking faster as they go by the bank. And it takes them 2 or 3 storefronts to get back into a window shopping rhythm. So these little subtle things that make the life of a street dynamic and interesting and for people to be involved is a very subtle thing and very, very engaging. But Holly White, he wrote this, he had these wonderful quotes. It's hard to create a space that will not attract people. What is remarkable is how often it's been accomplished. And that's what has happened around the world, is that we've been thinking more about design and object than around people and place. And we've been working at Harvard University, and we have done this plaza here. It's hard to create a space that will attract people. What is remarkable is how seldom this has been accomplished. And then one of the best things about water is the look and feel of it. It's not right to put water before people and keep them away from it. And you know that that woman's toe is going in and out of that water. Or these, you can't avoid these. They just suck you in and they give you some experiences that are memorable to you for many, many days. And then the whole idea of food, if you want to seed a place with activity, put out food. What's so wonderful is to go and watch people around an ice cream stand, for instance. And you see that people eat ice cream together at the same time, so on. But this was one of the most incredible experiences I've had as a picture taking. I've taken about 500,000 images. That the only person that does not have ice cream in that picture is that little kid. And that has never happened anywhere, ever. And so I decided, well, I'll take another picture. And he was now looking at me and he says, I know you know that I don't have ice cream. I'm just fooling you. So the other thing is benches are artifacts, the purpose of which is to punctuate architectural photographs. They're not so good for sitting. Well, the one on the top image is in Nîmes, France, and it's in front of a library that is an iconic library that you can never tell was a library by its design. And you know that these benches are just perching benches. But the bottom one is in Brooklyn, where I live, and it's a bookstore, and you can't go by that without slowing down, seeing what's going on, watching people interact, or going in. So it's one of those, if you have 10 of those kinds of storefronts, you know, much like the bazaars that you have here, you just can't not ignore what's going on. You're drawn into it. Well, streets need to be the same way, and many of yours are, but the new ones less so. And a bench that's 9 feet long is very different than a bench that's 4 feet long. Movable seating. This is public seating in a city in Germany. Has a very different dynamic than a bench. And these are our favorite benches where there are something like 18 people on the bottom bench there, all in different clusters sitting on that same bench. And then you can imagine that this is Paris, because there's so much passion in Paris that it's something you ignore, but it is part of the life of the Parisian. And then the idea of taking your shoes off. People take their shoes off in places where they're comfortable, and you could know that. And then the whole idea of the places where you are comfortable, where you can pat your dog with your foot, or sit in ways. You know when you come into good places how comfortable they are, and you relax and you become part of that place. So those are the signals about these good places. And here's 3 generations of women sitting on a bench in a city in California. But today, what we've done is we have created communities where we have isolated institutions. Each institution is unto itself. It often has its own parking lot. It's not about connecting with people, it's about supporting that institution. And in the future, we have to move towards these kinds of communities that are more sustainable. that are where there's all these institutions that are defined more by the place rather than by the siloed institution. So the whole concept of design has got to shift to where buildings are not standalone, but buildings are integrated into the public spaces. And public spaces are what define the buildings and make them work as a whole, connected to other institutions. So what we're saying is when you focus on place, you do everything differently, fundamentally differently. And what you do is we have to turn everything upside down to get it right side up, to get from inadequate to extraordinary. And believe me, once you've done this work for a while and you realize how exciting it is to turn things upside down, how exciting it is to start on the other side of that line and start looking at the way of connecting institutions, creating places, you begin to see a world that is incredibly bright and a great future. That's the paradigm shift that we're talking about with Habitat 3. We're going to have a conference in Vancouver in September where we will be having that as the prime direction, and we'll have 3,000 people come who will go out into the world to talk about that potential. I hope some of you will come. So placemaking is a community process. It's a natural, organic process. It localizes. It's economic development. It's scaled to each community. It creates social and place capital. And the outcomes are healthy, sustainable, viable communities. It's a powerful transition from where we are. We look at this concept of design-led versus place-led. And that does not mean that design is bad. What it does mean is that design needs to be much broader and much more dynamic than what we're getting. And I'm going to show you two projects, two different examples, the whole concept as it becomes place sensitive and to place led, the quality of that place goes up because the community has more engagement and more involvement and more ownership in it. So here's an example. These are both in Toronto. This is a place called Sherbourne Commons. It got the Canadian National Landscape Architecture Award for its design as a park, and the architects gave an award to this building, which no one knows what it is. I had to ask what it was, and it's a water filtration plant, but the architecture profession gave this their award. Neither of these are about place at all. This is the playground where they have black stones and white stones, and then you see there the seesaws are in one place, the benches are in one place. And what was so interesting is this little kid came, his parents came, and the first thing he did is he took the white stones from the white stone area and put them into the black stone area. And his parents quickly picked him up and they left because obviously they weren't supposed to be mixed. And then another couple came along, and there were thankfully two parents and two children, because there was one swing in one white stone zone and another swing in another white stone zone. And so they couldn't do that. But if you go to a place like Paris, where they have the playground and they have something to eat, these are gathering places. So people come in great numbers to those and meet people and connect with them. So it's not rocket science that a design as small objects versus a design that is really dynamic can have an enormous impact on how people use that. Now, this is one of the most puzzling things I've ever seen in my professional career, but it speaks to the other side of that high design argument, to how people create and make their own place. This was a very badly used park in Toronto, Dufferin Grove Park, and there was a lot of undesirable activity with what someone called toughs. And what they did is they decided to build a Portuguese bread oven, and then people came in, of all kinds came in and started breaking bread together, and it cut the ice on the bad activity and the good activity, and it started to merge. And they've done all these events, and this is one of the local people made this. This is not a park facility, and it's never been done in a park, but it was put into this park and the people own it. So how do you create those organic design opportunities? And with this kind of skills that interior designers have, you might be able to make that more functional, more exciting, but as it's being led in the community, how do you partner with the community about those kinds of issues? And then here's their amphitheater, and this is their playground. Now that playground is just basically mud with a pipe with some water, but that's where people want to go. So how do we connect more, instead of doing the kind of design that you don't want to use, how do you connect with communities so that the design supports them? I believe that that's more creative design, more inclusive design, and that's what the design of the future needs to be. So if you take these kinds of activities that are in that park, you begin to see the diversity of that can happen. Now another example is Lincoln Center in New York, which is a very highly ordered design project. Again, very much design-led, and they do design buildings like this with a sloped roof, and there's only five umbrellas there. Very few people can eat there. And then they have a water feature like this, which again, you can't look at. So take that water feature and do something like that, and you have a place that people will gather and it will draw people in, and take that restaurant and do something like that, and you've got a major destination. So how do you take this sort of simple idea that's not very complex and turn it into something that's extraordinarily interesting, dynamic, and complex? So in Perth, we were working on a cultural center there. These are the buildings. Many of them are brutalist architecture, are heritage buildings, so they have no energy in them. They're just the building itself. And these are the kinds of institutions, and these are the areas that we worked on in the beginning with the community. And we worked with a lot of designers, but the designers had to wait until the community gave the program of how to make that place come alive. And so this is the vision of uses and activities laid out into it, and it actually went into the buildings. Inside the buildings and outside were an integral part of this, because when we do something called the Power of 10, we don't care where the walls are, we just want the whole space that's public to become alive. So this is a before and after, a before and after, and after, before, after, before, after, after, after. So the whole place became the biggest destination in Western Australia really quickly. And it was done what we call lighter, quicker, cheaper. So it was all done in 2 years, and it became the primary destination in Western Australia that was part of a cultural center. So the tools we use are the Power of 10, and we do an evaluation game. We do surveys and time-lapse and stuff like that. We do a placemaking vision, which that you just saw was that vision. It was a short-term vision that people would start to implement. Now, the best thing about that vision is that nothing came out like that vision, because it got them to a level where they could go to do a better job. So when we came back, everything they did was better than what we had together worked out in the beginning. So the placemaking vision was just a step to get you to the next level, which was really powerful. So the Power of 10 is this is in New York, where we've done a lot of work. If a great city has 10 destinations, and each of those destinations, there are 10 places, and this is Bryant Park in the middle, and then the one on the right is one part of Bryant Park. You get 10 times 10 times 10 reasons to be in that particular place. So you go back to our bookstore, and you begin to see how complex that is and how dynamic it is. And then you take places, that this is where we worked, was Bryant Park and Rockefeller Center, and those today are the destinations. And there are 10 destinations in New York that are all define that city. And if you take this to a small town, to a street, to a big city, you can take this same concept and work it out in neighborhoods or a city as a whole, or a street, or even a small street, to be able to take that. So New York City was transformed by that, and when we started working at Rockefeller Center, they asked us what kind of spikes to put on the ledges, and we said benches, and it changed the whole dynamic of that city. And they took the parking lot out, they took a bank out and put in the Today Show, they put a giant puppy dog in front of Rockefeller Center, the most prestigious office building in the world, They never would have done that prior to this sort of opening up and experimenting. So this kind of placemaking kind of opened up everyone to much more dynamic, much more interesting. And this then added the value to Rockefeller Center. We worked on Times Square and set that up. Many of you probably heard about how that went from these kinds of studies to a transformation like this. And then Bryant Park was another one where there were 9 groups of people dealing in drugs. This is a before and after, and then breaking it down into these different destinations. Each of those had 10 things to do. You have a place you cannot avoid that you want to be in on a regular basis. And then working at Harvard University, these 3 destinations, Harvard Square, Harvard Yard, and then this Harvard Plaza. And this is what, for 350 years, this is what Harvard Yard looked like. And then all of a sudden, one day, this happened. The seating was put out, and there was a fundamental change in that. And then we were working also on this one, this large space. And what's interesting is we broke that down into 10, power of 10, really 14 places. And then each of those places had a program of uses. And then this is one of the outcomes of that. And this became the gathering place for the entire community. It was no longer just Harvard University, but it was Harvard University and the neighborhoods. And there's a market there, there's an art market, and it's now become the central square for an entire town or even part of Cambridge. And then the big one that we worked on was Detroit, where Detroit was so down and out until about 10 years ago that it really was deserted. The population had shrunk by 2/3. Detroit in 1917 looked like that. We came in, that monument right there is the same monument right there. Everything had been torn down and totally, basically evacuated. That to this, and now it's gone to this. And we did a placemaking plan with a fellow who is a billionaire who's taken on his passion to make that city work again. And we announced a plan in 2013. This was the area that we worked in. This is what it looked like. This was the vision. And this is what happened 3 months after we announced the plan. So we actually implemented the plan almost immediately. And by doing what we call, and I'll show you in a minute, what lighter, quicker, cheaper is, you can actually move through government's regulations, because what you're doing is you're doing experiments, you're testing, you're trying to figure out what to happen, rather than going through these machinations where you really never come up with something and the plans are put to the side. And so this is what happened there. And then we actually put in a beach right in the center of the city. So 2 examples of what we call lighter, quicker, cheaper. A friend of ours came up with the idea of light, quick, cheap in London, and then there's a new one in Copenhagen. And I'm sure some of you have seen these kinds of things. But the future is really in transforming cities through quick activations, working with local entrepreneurs and activists. And that's where we see the massive transformation going on around the world. So one of them, and this is an old one, is Gabriel's Wharf in London. And this blank wall right here, this friend, he painted the wall to look like that. That's the same picture of that wall became that wall, just with paint. And then he put garage structures in front of it, and he had artists design the storefronts, and then 3 months later he activated it with small businesses. So you can do this kind of light, quick, cheap activation, and then as you do it, it's through the design of this is far more intense and dynamic than anything you can imagine, because there's so much variety and excitement there. So this is what it looked like, and there were immediately these jobs created. So this kind of light, quick, cheap activation creates jobs, draws in people who are looking for ways to become entrepreneurs and startups and do that kind of stuff. And then one of the ones that last summer we saw in Copenhagen was on this island here, which is totally disconnected from everything. but it became one of the biggest destinations in Copenhagen almost immediately when they did it. And 5 chefs got together and made this happen. It's called Paper Island, and this is the outside. And then the inside, what they did is they put in these light structures and businesses in them. And it's constantly changing as new businesses come into it. They only have a contract for 2 or 3 years to do this, but it is an incredibly dynamic entrepreneurial center of activity and place that we're all looking for. So the whole idea of complexity versus order, and the concept that growth means managing complexity, that you don't simplify, and that cities generate complexity. And that's what we know from our work. And so a strategy for implementation, and this involves you especially, is you bring the inside out. Make the entire site a public destination. It's no longer about a building separating, it's about integrating the whole site. Crowdsource ideas, community input and partnerships. The lighter, quicker, cheaper. Short term is 1 to 4 months, long term is 2 years. These things have to happen. We have to change our communities quickly. That includes the streets as well. I'll show you one on that. We have to create energetic anchors of activity. We get life on the plazas and the walkways and parks and make it a movable feast. So now, last night we were talking a lot about how traffic has sort of taken over the cities in Turkey, as they have everywhere in the world. And so if we begin to think of streets as places, as public spaces, not as just travel spaces. So when you design your community around cars and traffic, you get more cars and traffic. Now when you design your community around people and places, you get more people and places. So taking that, the paradigm shift is moving away from the narrow idea of traffic engineer to the concept of place. And one of the great examples, I'm jumping way forward, is the whole concept of shared streets, of shared space. And this is a traffic engineer in North Holland who says the only way to make a busy road intersection safe is to make it feel dangerous. And how do you bring people on foot and on bikes back into the world of those streets and make them safer? So he has come up with ways of doing it, taking very dangerous intersections and turning them into places where people, an intersection like that does nothing for that community, but when you do something like that, you've changed the whole dynamic of that road. And you've made eye contact. His whole purpose as an engineer was to make eye contact between people and vehicles, pedestrians and bicycles and people, pedestrians. And so when you come to an intersection, you actually make eye contact and then make the decision who goes first. And it's that kind of shared space that actually has reduced accidents dramatically and made those places safer, more successful, more dynamic, and more economically viable. So we run a big program on this, and in another place in that town, this is our guy who runs the traffic transportation department. We put him out in the middle of the road. There are no stoplights, no signals. It's just an open space. The road narrows a little bit as you come into it. We put him out there. The truck comes by. No one honks. He has just as much right to be in the middle of the road as anyone else in a vehicle. So then we put him in the middle of the road in a chair, and he's still alive and still working. But that whole concept of a shared space has a powerful way of integrating a community, drawing people into it, and making it less a road and more of a place. So what he says, if you want vehicles to behave like they're in a village, you build a village. And essentially what it means is a transfer of power and responsibility from the state to the individual and the community. Now, there's one other little one that I wanted to share with you. In Argentina, in Buenos Aires, in one of the neighborhoods, this is a street that in the morning it's 2 lanes, in two one-way streets, 2 lanes each. But as lunchtime comes, and this is what it looks like, and the bus comes through, but then as lunch comes along and dinner, what happens is that the street fills up, and it begins to become more and more about a public space, more about a square, the 4 corners to here, and then this, and then people come along because there's something going on there, and they can't walk on the sidewalk, so they walk in the street, and then someone comes along with a bicycle, And then the bollards are not used just to separate the cars, they're now used as a place to sit. So you can change the dynamic of a street to become more public really quite quickly. So in closing, remember this, we have to turn everything upside down to get it right side up, to get from inadequate to extraordinary. But getting it right side up is really tough. It's really hard. But it takes this kind of movement, this kind of collection of activists, of change agents, of community builders, placemakers, economic entrepreneurs, innovative kinds of activity to define the community, the neighborhood, the city of the future. And remember this diagram with how this place can enhance all of these. And what you're really talking about, we're talking about, is really transforming politics to be more about community and more about place and less about ideology. And that's a big shift, and it's something that we're seeing happen in some of the most engaged communities around the world. And it's always a campaign. You know, you develop this vision, you communicate it, you look for impediments, you organize a team, you attack complacency, you produce short-term wins, take on bigger challenges, and then connect change to the culture of the community. So these ideas can grow, and they can grow fast, and they can have big rewards, and they can happen quickly. And in September, we're going to have a whole week of this kind of activity from people around the world. There will be 3,000 people coming there, and you're welcome to bring a team from Turkey or from some of your cities to be able to come back and use what you learn there, what I'm outlining here and much more, to help transform your communities to the kind of places you want to live in. So we have something called Pro Walk, Pro Bike, Pro Place, and that's about human scale, it's about active transportation, community campaigns. The future of places is more about research, about policy and governance, theory and practice. And then placemaking leadership, these are the activists that can overcome obstacles through the collective efforts that they engage in, about scaling up the impact and addressing global challenges. That's our website, and that's it. So, thank you very much. So I hope I've started a conversation, and that maybe we can add to this and engage, because this is really it's such a big idea, but it's a very comfortable, very natural idea. It isn't something, it's something we all want deep inside us, and everyone we've ever met always wants this same thing of connecting comfortably with people in safe environments that define the future of the communities we want to live in.